Well, I don't know how you guys started off your afternoon, but I started off my afternoon with the intention of coming into the sewing room and straightening it up a little bit. Right here is not so bad, but all over here really needs to be cleaned up. Really needs to be reorganized. Where I've pulled stuff out, started projects, worked on different things, and then just I've got stacks of different stuff sitting everywhere. So today's project was going to be to clean up the sewing room. But instead, it ended up with, well, another project being added to me. It always happens that way. But you know what? The way I look at it is I'm cleaning up the sewing room by finishing these projects. Not long ago, we went through some stuff here in the sewing room where we had different pieces of fabric and we organized them. And so I had a big stack of 5-inch squares. And well, I decided I wanted to use some of those. So what I'm doing is I am taking them and, well, let's go over to the cutting table and I'll show you. If you remember from a previous video, this is the stack of 5-inch squares that we had cut from scraps of fabric. So that's what I'm working through. And I had taken the 5-inch squares and the white 5-inch squares, whatever you want your background to be, which in my case is white. So I've got a white 5-inch square and I've got a print 5-inch square, and I've sewn them together all the way around it, not leaving any opening. You can see all the way around this is stitched. So then I'm gonna take it and I'm gonna cut it with an X across it, across both sides. I'm gonna go from one angle to the next. Carefully pick my ruler up, go to the other angle, and cut directly across that way as well. And that yields me 4 half square triangles. So then I'll take these over to the ironing board and I will iron these open, and while I'm squaring them up, I'll end up getting rid of these dog ears. So I've got 4 like this now. When I open them up, they all look like that. So now that you've got 4 and you've ironed them, here's a stack I've already done. So here you go, right here. I've got 1, 2, 3, 4 of this print. To square them up, I'm gonna take my 3.5-inch ruler, because these would be 3-inch squares. So I'm gonna take them and I'm going to lay them on my cutting board, take my 3.5-inch ruler, and it's got a 3 line right here. That means anything inside of this is 3 inches. So I'm gonna lay it like that. I want this angled line. Can you see this black line across here? I want that on my seam. So I'm gonna take this and lay that on my seam, bring it down to where all of my pieces are within that 3-inch line, and I'm gonna cut like that. Then I'm gonna turn it and I'm gonna do the same thing at the other angle, so that now my square is a 3-inch square. And I'm gonna do that with all of these pieces, and then we'll go back to the sewing machine and we'll sew them together. Before we go over to the sewing machine, I'm going to show you one more time, because if you're like me, I like to see it a couple times. So I've got my square on the table. I've got my ruler with the angled black line going the same direction as my seam does. I'm going to lay my ruler on it, line that seam along my black line here on the ruler. Make sure all of the square underneath here is in the 3-inch mark. And there's some stuff hanging over, but I want at least all of it covered in the 3. So then I'll cut these 2 sides, throw them to the side, turn it the other way, line the 3 up again on the good sides that we've already trimmed, take my my cutter, and cut those sides. So now this is trimmed. So now we can go form these into the square we're going to make for this quilt. We're going to make pinwheels with our squares. And so I've got one laying out here that I leave out the entire time I'm making this quilt, just so that I can remember the layout and not have to stop and think about which way they go. So this is my template pretty much that's just gonna sit right here on the table while I'm making my other ones. So I'll take 4 squares that are all alike, and I'm using scraps for this. All of these pieces are scraps. So you could do it like I'm doing it, where all the points in the pinwheel are the same color, or you could do it where all of these 4 points are different colors. That's up to you. But for me, I'm doing them all the same color. So I'm gonna take one and lay it like this with the color down, one with the color up, one with the color down like that, and one with the color up like that. So that forms my new pinwheel. So now I'll take this one to the sewing machine and I'll sew them together. I'll flip this one on top of this one and sew down this side right here. So I'm gonna line it up and then sew a 1/4 inch. I'm gonna go ahead before I even cut that thread, and I'm gonna do the same thing with this one. I'm gonna flip this one over here and I'm gonna sew down this seam. And I tend to do a lot of them at one time. Like I'll sew 10, 12, 15 of them, just like I just did this one. What'll end up with being 1 square. But for this purpose, I'm showing you how, so I'm gonna do it one at a time. So I've got this unit and I've got this unit. And remember, they went like, let's see, they went like that to form the pinwheel. If you notice, if I turned this one like this, you're just making the same unit over and over again. Bottom left print, top left print. Bottom left print, top left print. All you're doing then is flipping one of them upside down to form that pinwheel. So maybe that won't be as confusing for you when you're starting to put it together. If you don't, for me, having this pinwheel here reminds me of how the layout goes. I don't have to sit and think. So I like this. You may not need it, but I do. So I'm gonna take this unit and I'm gonna put it on top of this unit and sew it together. So I'm gonna flip it up like this. I'm gonna take these seams and I'm gonna line them up. And I want one seam going this way and one seam going this way. So I'm gonna pin it like that. Then I'm going to take these and line them up. And I'm gonna take it to the sewing machine and I'm gonna sew all the way down this side. And I forgot to mention that when I do this state, I starch it. So it's already pretty good and flat. And then when I get to this state, I'm gonna iron it again. So I've got it like this, but you see this little hump in the middle? I don't want that hump in the middle when it comes time for quilting. So I'm gonna get rid of that. I'm going to flip it upside down, take this middle seam. Some people take the entire unit and open all these seams and iron them flat. I just like this one center one flat. So I'm gonna take it and I'm gonna open it up, take it over here to the ironing board, spray it with my best press starch, and then I'm gonna iron it open. So I'm gonna open this up. I've already sprayed it. And I'm gonna open that seam up. Now these other ones, I don't care, they can stay closed up. But I really want that middle one right there opened up. I've starched it again so that now that seam right there is flat. It's not puffy like it was a minute ago. So now this one is good. I'm gonna put it to the stack over here of all my other ones and I'm gonna keep going. Once you've got your pinwheels ironed and flat, They should all measure 5.5 inches. So once you've measured and trimmed them down to 5.5 inches, you can start sewing them together. And I'm just going to lay one on top of the other. Try to match those side seams up. Sew down the side. I'm not putting any sashing between it or anything. And then when you're sewing them together, they'll start looking like that. And then we're gonna end up with a quilt. This right here, to me, is fun because for one, I'm using my scraps. And I'm using what a lot of people would have thrown away to make another quilt. Not only am I using my scraps and I'm liking that I'm using my scraps, but also I remember what some of these were in. Like I remember making the entire quilt out of this whole line of fabric, and that was left over. So now I've got the memory of that quilt. I made one of my kids' quilts with this fabric. So I mean, I know a lot of where they came from and I like that. So that's an added bonus to me for this Scrappy quilt. So let's keep going and sew all these together. I don't know yet how big I'm gonna make it. I'm gonna see how big it turns out lengthwise, and then I'll just make it from there. So let's keep going. I've got my rows, 2 of my rows ready now, and I've decided that I wanted them 12 squares long. So this is as long as my row is. And I'm gonna take one and the other, and I'm gonna line them up, flipping them upside down like this, and then I'll start pinning, matching those seams. So I'll take that seam right there, line it up, roll it to the top, and pin that. This is where I'll start sewing, so I don't need to really pin right there. But I am gonna pin all these other places to make sure that they match, so that when I'm sewing them together, they're all gonna be where they need to be. So I'm gonna pin this whole row, and then I'll sew it. Once I've got it pinned down, I will sew that 1/4 inch seam all the way down this side, taking my pins out as I go. So I'm gonna go all the way down this side and I'll come back to you. I have finished 2 rows, and this is what it looks like. Remember that it's Scrappy, so it's not supposed to match completely, but it gives me memories from each block because these fabrics have been used in other projects, and some of them I'll remember where I used it in, or if I used it in one of my kids' quilts when they were little, that kind of thing. So this is how I'm gonna do it. It's 12 squares long. I'm gonna keep going. It's gonna be an ongoing project. I'm gonna keep going until it gets as long as I decide I want it to be. Remember, if you know me by now, you know that my motto is finished is better than perfect. So to me, I'm not gonna stress if my points don't match up just perfect. I try my best to get them that way, and if it's way off, then I'll fix it. But if it's not that bad, I'm not gonna bother it for this one. If I'm putting it in a quilt show, yes, I would. But for this type, it's not gonna bother me. It's a preference thing. If you're a perfectionist on everything you do, then you're probably gonna wanna rip things out if it doesn't match up just right. But none of these looked bad to me. So we are keeping on going and adding some more rows to it. It's gonna be, like I said, an ongoing project. So when I get 20 or 30 minutes and I don't wanna start a new project, I'll just grab that tote over there with all this stuff in it, and I'll get to making more of these. And I do know already how I'm going to quilt it. I am going to quilt it along these lines. I'm gonna trace this triangle and trace this triangle and do the same thing with this one. I'm just straight lines on every outline of every triangle. So it's gonna be a little while to quilt it. It'll take a little bit to quilt this one, but it will be fun and it will be beautiful when it's done. So I'm gonna keep going with this project, and you keep going with your project. If you're making one like me, send it to me. Send me a picture. Let me see what yours looks like. I enjoy seeing what you guys are doing as well. So until next time, you guys have a great rest of your day and happy quilting.